Welcome to this virtual parallel event of the 45th session of the Human Rights Council meeting held this week at the Palais des Nations, the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. This event is under the auspices of Incomendios, an NGO in consultative status with the ECOSOC. It is also co-sponsored by the Koani Foundation in Hawaii, as well as the Peace for Okinawa Coalition. My name is Lyla Berg, and I am speaking to you from Hawaii. I'm a former public school teacher and principal, and a former state legislator in the Hawaii House of Representatives. I will be moderator for this panel. Today's topic is demilitarizing the Pacific, Hawaii, Okinawa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas Islands. The United States has long held an extensive military presence in the Pacific, particularly on islands such as Hawaii, Okinawa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas. The native peoples of these islands have long opposed the presence of the military and have demanded a significant reduction of military imposition on their lands. The United States attempts to placate these demands by moving large numbers of military personnel from one island to another. Recently, the United States and Japan decided that they would move 1/3 of Okinawa's military presence to Guam. Now the native peoples of these islands have joined together to outright condemn the transfer of military personnel to and from various islands, and to call for the complete removal of military forces from the Pacific. Joining us today as panelists are His Excellency Leon KAULAHAO Siu of Hawaii, Mr. Robert Kajiwara of Okinawa, and Congresswoman SHEILA BABAUTA of the Northern Marianas. Our panelists are influential representatives from their respective locations and will be discussing the impact of the military on their respective islands. Our first speaker is His Excellency Leon KAULAHAO Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Hawaiian Kingdom and prominent strategist, advocate, and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. Minister Siu is a familiar participant in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and is working to restore and develop new relations between the Hawaiian Kingdom and other states. He is chair of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City, co-author of the book Modus Vivendi, Situation of West Papua, and was nominated in 2017 for the Nobel Peace Prize. Aloha, Minister Siu. The floor is yours.
Aloha, aloha ia mai o koa e maluhia hoi ke akua, e ko ka ko makua e ka haku Yesu a me ka uhane e mulele. Greetings from Hawaii. It's good again to address the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you to Incomendios for providing this opportunity for this parallel event, this side event, so we can talk about this really, really pertinent topic in the Pacific at this point, and that is the demilitarization of the Pacific. And we're not talking about, well, we are talking about the entire Pacific, but we're talking about specific areas, and for ourselves, Hawaii, and for Okinawa, as well as for Guam. And now these three areas are particularly impacted, of course, by the United States military presence in our islands. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in Hawaii and how this entire militarization of these Pacific islands came about. So back in the late 19th century, the United States was looking westward past California and out into the Pacific and wanting very much to expand its influence out into the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Hawaiian Islands have been enjoying a 60-year trade relationship with the United States, and particularly the sugar industry had grown tremendously during the Civil War of the Americas. And in that, the Hawaiian Islands became the major sugar producer for the northern states of the United States. After the Civil War, so what happened with the sugar industry in Hawaii is that it boomed. There was a tremendous amount of growth and there's a tremendous amount of profits being made by growing more and more sugar. And that lasted for a few years after the Civil War. But once the southern states came back online with their sugar production, of course, the United States did not depend so much upon the Hawaiian Islands, and tariffs went into place, and unfavorable trade levels began to become discussed. And so the Hawaiian Islands, the people who owned the sugar plantations and ran the sugar business, which was by now a huge business in Hawaii, so they were very panicked about how they were going to be selling more sugar and how they could keep the market stable. So they plotted, and they felt that the best way to do so was to have Hawaii, the Hawaiian Kingdom, their country, annexed to the United States. That would solve their problem of having a stable sugar price for the sugar crops that they raised here in Hawaii. And so that was their motivation for pushing for annexation. And that started about 20 years prior to even the annexation happening. And all during this time, the monarch, King Kalakaua, and the later Queen Liliuokalani, were trying to hold the line and say, we do not want to be annexed to the United States, and that we are a sovereign country, and that we will make do. So this faction of sugar planters and businessmen, bankers, and the like, and shippers in Hawaii started to really plot against the government, to overthrow the government and to annex it to the United States. Now, this had been vetted with members of the United States, of the President of the United States, his cabinet members, particularly the War Department at the time. And what was going on was that the War Department of the United States, in looking to expand its influence into the Pacific, was eyeing Pearl Harbor as the ideal harbor for their Navy in the Pacific. And so there had been years of negotiations going on to have access to Pearl Harbor. So there were treaties, reciprocity treaties signed between the Hawaiian Kingdom and the United States to allow Pearl Harbor to be used by their Navy for a coaling station. It was not to be a military base, but a coaling station, meaning they could put up mountains of coal there and then refurbish the coal burning furnaces on their steamships, their Navy vessels. So it was a coaling station, but this was not quite enough for the United States. So they started to look toward how can we actually acquire exclusive use of Pearl Harbor for our use. So that's what happened. They started to come into collusion with the interests in Hawaii that wanted to join the United States through annexation, and the military industrial complex in the United States wanted to secure Pearl Harbor. So the two colluded, and they came up with this plot, which they finally executed on January 17th, 1893. And that's when the sugar planters and their chums got together they had formed what they call a committee of safety. And the committee of safety was to seize control of the Hawaiian Islands, seize control of the government, depose the Queen, and then enter into negotiations to annex Hawaii to the United States. And meanwhile, the United States would support this with the landing of a group of a company of Marines, about 160 of them, to ensure that the sugar planters could succeed in overthrowing the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So this plot hatched, and on January 16th, 1893, the Marines landed in Honolulu, bivouacked out in front of the palace, which was the seat of the government at the time. Well, the seat of government was in the government building, but the palace was where the home of the monarch was. So they basically pointed their guns, their cannons and their guns at the palace in this display of protection of the revolt that was going on, or the usurpation that was going on. And so the next day, on the 17th of January, 1893, the Committee of Safety declared themselves to be in charge of the Hawaiian Kingdom government, and ordered that the Queen step down. And the Foreign Ministry in Hawaii at the time of the United States, which is like the embassy of the United States, its representative, the ambassador, John L. Stevens, then backed the usurpers of the government, those that were creating a coup d'etat, and said that the United States now supported this fake government, or this insurgency. So the Queen actually, at that point, yielded to the United States, to the President of the United States, because she understood that this was a purely illegal act under international law, and that this could be settled through diplomacy and through international legal means. And so she was not worried about this being a permanent situation. She thought it was very temporary, and so she basically petitioned the United States to return her country. That didn't quite happen, and the insurgents sent a group to Washington, D.C., and within a week or so after their arrival, they had a treaty of annexation signed by the President of the United States, who at that time was Benjamin Harrison, and it was his administration that was behind this collusion of overthrowing the Hawaiian Kingdom. And anyway, he signed a treaty of annexation. It had to go to the U.S. Senate for ratification, and so it went there. But meanwhile, because Benjamin Harrison was a lame duck president, his presidency ended about a month and a half, 2 months after the insurgency, after the coup d'etat. So he had not gotten the Treaty of Annexation ratified by the Senate. And when the new president came in, Grover Cleveland was the new president. When he came in, he immediately withdrew the Treaty of Annexation from the Senate, and basically told them to hold off, and he conducted his own investigation. And the investigation goes on, and he uncovers the plot of what had happened, and basically disassociates the United States from what had happened, and said that the United States had actually committed an act of war against a friendly nation, and said that the United States was obligated to act in kind to return the proper government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, meaning the Hawaiian Kingdom government. So that's what happened. However, the United States military forces refused to actually withdraw or use that opportunity to wait until the president was out of office. And when the president left office in 1897, immediately another Treaty of Annexation ensued. And again, this was highly pushed, but this time it was being pushed by the new president of the United States, McKinley, and his cabinet and his staff, and particularly Theodore Roosevelt, who was his vice president, and other hawkish members who at that time were convinced that it was Hawaii's, the United States' manifest destiny to expand its influence into the Pacific. And so that's what they did. They cooked up a pretense under the cover of the Spanish-American War, in which they seized the Philippines, used Hawaii as the staging area for not only the Spanish-American War, which was fairly short-lived, it was just a few weeks long, but after that ensued a 4 or 5 year battle with the Filipinos, who thought that they were being liberated. But the United States then announced that they were indeed being colonized now by the United States. So the Filipinos took up arms, and they fought a battle that lasted about 5 years. Roughly 250,000, at least 250,000 Filipinos died in that war. and about 5,000 Americans died in that war. But that was the test. That was the pattern that was beginning to take place. Was the United States decided, and used Hawaii as the staging area for its reach into the Pacific, and that is where it all started, with the taking of the Hawaiian Islands and the establishment of military bases in the Hawaiian Islands. So after that, of course, there were a number of different wars in which the Hawaiian Islands were involved, mainly as a staging area. However, World War II, of course, Hawaii became a major target, and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that day of infamy is very, very well remembered. But the thing that most people don't realize was that Japan was out to cripple the U.S. fleet that was harbored at Pearl Harbor, which is still where the U.S. fleet is harbored today, by the way. But the thing was a strategic move on the part of Japan to cripple American military forces in the Pacific, and that's what occurred at Pearl Harbor. So at this point, the Japanese attack was not against, of course, the Hawaiian Islands. It was against the military installations in the Hawaiian Islands, and that has been the case ever since. So Hawaii has been the main military outpost. It is the largest military command in the world. So, and that is headquartered in Honolulu. But what has happened over the years is that the Hawaiian Islands, or particularly Pearl Harbor and the military bases located on Oahu, are still the prime target for any enemy of the United States. So the benefit of having the United States military here is far reduced compared to the threat that it is to the people of the Hawaiian Islands. And we had an incident that happened in January 2018, I believe, in which there was a false alarm. There was a missile alert that went out to everyone's cell phone, which said that there was an incoming missile. And it was at the point where the words were being exchanged between North Korea and the United States, the belligerent words. And so it was a highly plausible attack from a nuclear attack from North Korea. That's what everyone assumed. And so everyone panicked. Now, it took about 40 minutes for the all clear signal to sound that there wasn't an attack. But in the meantime, what was exposed was that the United States has not made any preparation whatsoever to protect the civilian populations of Hawaii against a nuclear attack or against any kind of that attack. So we are in the midst of, or we are a big red X in the middle of the Pacific for any enemy of the United States to attack. Now, the level of warfare, of course, has increased tremendously from World War II, from December 7th, 1941, where that was a target. Japan sent in its fleet of bombers and specifically bombed the military targets. Today, one nuclear weapon detonated a couple of miles or a mile up above the island of Oahu would decimate the entire island and annihilate the entire population, whether they're civilian or military. And so this is the level of threat that we are facing today, much, much greater than what we faced in 1941 or even since. So this is why we're calling for the demilitarization of the Pacific. And it is a similar situation with Okinawa and with Guam. And we do not want to be wrapped up in this international global bullying on the part of big countries with big weapons, because we are at this point put at tremendous risk of not only our lives, but our existence, the existence of our nation. So the Hawaiian Kingdom is for calling the United States to withdraw completely from the Hawaiian Islands. And we want to do this in a peaceful manner, in a manner in which the United States can realize that they need to withdraw from foreign soil, our soil, and that it is our call to make. The Hawaiian Kingdom needs to make the call as to whether or not we want any kind of military, U.S. military or foreign military presence in our islands. So this is where we stand. We are calling upon the United States to return the Hawaiian Islands, or actually to back off and to, we are asserting our claim to the Hawaiian Islands to determine for ourselves the how we should be governed, as well as what policies we should have in the future in the area of international relations. So thank you very much for this time. I hope that you have been educated a little bit about our situation, and I would like to hear again from the other members of this panel. Mahalo nui, aloha.